Before we begin, tell me where you watching from today. Wherever you are, sending love your way. The wind came down from the Sabinal Ridge the way it always did in late autumn, dry and mean, dragging the smell of scorched grass across the porch of the Halloran Ranch. 62-year-old Merritt Halloran stood in her doorway with a tin cup of cold coffee going colder in her hand, and she watched a stranger who was not a stranger sit at her kitchen table without invitation. He had removed his hat. He had not removed his gun. On the pine boards in front of him lay a folded auction notice, its ink still wet enough to smudge, and beneath it a second paper she recognized before she read it. It was a bill of sale for her own land, signed in a hand that looked almost like her dead husband's, but wasn't. Merritt did not scream. Merritt did not weep. She only tightened her grip on the cup until the tin bent, because 30 years ago, before she buried Elias, before she learned to bake bread and mend fences, she had been someone else entirely, and that someone else had just been called back to work. The stranger smiled and said one name, Cyrus Vane, and Merritt Halloran, who had sworn never to touch a trigger again, understood the price of everything she was about to do. The Halloran spread sat where the Sabinal Creek bent east. 400 head of cattle grazing on 8 sections of mesquite and blue grama that Elias had bought section by section over 23 years of honest, stubborn work. He had died in the spring of a bad heart on a good horse, thrown when the animal shied at a rattler, and Merritt had brought him home draped across the saddle herself, because there had been nobody else close enough to help. That was 7 months ago. In 7 months she had learned the ledger, learned the tally, learned to stand at the branding fire without flinching when the iron hissed. She had told herself she was learning. She had told herself the men respected her. She had told herself the widow's mourning band around her sleeve was enough armor for the country. She had been wrong on every count. The stranger at her table was named Roan Petty, and he worked for a man named Cyrus Vane, who owned the biggest bank in Usler County and half the county judges besides. Roan slid the auction notice across the pine boards with 2 fingers, the way a man slides a card in a saloon, and told Merritt that Elias had signed a note against the ranch 6 years ago to cover a bad cattle season. The interest, Roan said, had compounded. The note had matured. The bank would be foreclosing in 21 days. Merritt asked to see the note. Roan produced it. The signature was almost perfect. Almost. Elias had always crossed his second L with a small downward hook, a habit he'd carried from a schoolmaster in Kentucky. This signature crossed it flat. Merritt set the paper down and asked Roan to leave her house. He did, but slowly, tipping his hat with the small, tight smile of a man who has been told to make an impression and knows he has succeeded. She stood at the window and watched him ride out, and when the dust settled she walked to the barn and pulled down a locked pine chest from the rafters that had not been opened in 19 years. Inside was a Colt Peacemaker with mother-of-pearl grips yellowed like old teeth, a leather belt cracked at the buckle, and a folded reward poster showing a younger woman with Merritt's eyes and a different name. She did not take the pistol out. She only looked at it, and then she closed the chest and locked it again and put the key in her apron pocket. She was not that woman anymore. She had promised Elias, on the day she married him, that she would never be that woman again. She went to the bunkhouse and told the 6 men still working for her that she was staying, that the ranch was staying, that anyone who wanted to leave could take a week's wages and go, no questions asked, but that anyone who stayed was staying to work, not to fight. 4 of them stayed. 2 took the wages. She did not blame the 2 who left. She knew what Cyrus Vane was. Everybody in Usler County knew what Cyrus Vane was. That night the wind rose. She sat by the lantern in the kitchen and read the forged note by its yellow light until she had memorized every stroke, and near midnight she heard a horse come into the yard. She took down Elias's old shotgun from above the door and stepped onto the porch. It was her foreman, Ezra Kite, a lean black man of 48 who had ridden for Elias since the ranch was 200 acres. His face in the lantern light was gray. He said only, "Ma'am, they've cut the water above the east pasture. Dammed the creek with rocks and green cottonwood. Cattle are already circling the dry bed. Somebody knew exactly where to put the dam. Somebody who's ridden this land before." Merritt lowered the shotgun. She looked past Ezra into the dark, Toward the ridge she could not see but could feel, and she understood that Cyrus Vane had not sent one man with one paper. He had sent an operation, patient and precise, and it had been moving against her ranch for longer than 7 months. Longer, perhaps, than Elias had been dead. She said, "Ezra, tomorrow we ride the fence line. All of it. And you and I are going to have a long talk about who knew what and when." The wind hit the shutters. The lantern guttered. Somewhere on the ridge a coyote answered a sound that was not a coyote, and Merritt Halloran, who had buried her husband and her old name and her old life, stood on her porch and listened to the country tell her the war had already begun. The town of Corvell sat 9 miles south of the Halloran Ranch, a single dust-colored street between a livery and a whitewashed church whose bell was cracked and had been for 11 years. Merritt rode in the next morning wearing black wool and a plain hat, Ezra beside her on a sorrel gelding, and every man on the boardwalk found something to look at that was not her face. That was the first thing. The second was the 2 riders idling in front of the bank who did not belong to the county. Long coats, oiled boots, hands that never wandered far from their belts. Cyrus Vane's imported men. Vane himself was waiting for her in the bank's back office. He was 70 years old, thin as a fence post, his hair the color of wet ash, and he stood when she entered because his manners had been built in Boston 40 years before the frontier had made him rich. He offered her tea. She refused it. He offered her a chair. She took it, but sat forward, hands folded on her knees the way Elias had taught her to sit when a man was about to lie. Vane spoke for 11 minutes without pause. He spoke of Elias with warmth. He spoke of the note with regret. He spoke of the ranch as though it were already an object in his coat pocket, already listed in some column of some ledger back in his private safe. He spoke of a fair price. Below fair, but not insulting. Enough, he said, for a woman of Merritt's age to move to San Antonio and live in comfort with her sister. Merritt had no sister. She had never had a sister. Vane knew this. Vane was letting her know that he knew. She said only, "The signature is forged." Vane's face did not change. He said, "The court will decide, Mrs. Halloran. And I have known Judge Powell for a very long time." She left the bank. Outside, the 2 long-coated men had not moved. Across the street, on the shaded side, Sheriff Ambrose Doyle was leaning against a porch post, thumbs in his belt, watching her the way a butcher watches a calf. Doyle had been sheriff for 11 years. Doyle had never once ridden onto the Halloran spread. Doyle had also, she now understood, never once ridden onto any spread Cyrus Vane had eventually purchased. Ordinary law was not going to help her. Ordinary law was on Vane's payroll. She rode with Ezra to the telegraph office at the end of the street, and while Ezra held the horses she went inside and asked the operator, a nervous young man named Fenley, to send a wire to a lawyer in Austin. Fenley took her money. Fenley wrote down her message. When she stepped outside she saw, through the office's back window, Fenley immediately walk her paper to a second desk where a man in a bowler hat read it and pocketed it. The wire was never going to be sent. She had known before she wrote it, but she had wanted to know for certain that the telegraph, too, belonged to Vane. That afternoon she rode to a place she had not visited in 6 years. It was a low stone house at the edge of a pinyon grove, and it belonged to a woman named Isolde Warwick, a former Army scout of 50, half Comanche, half Scots-Irish, who had once tracked a band of horse thieves for Elias through 8 days of blizzard and had not spoken to Merritt since Elias's funeral, because Isolde believed funerals were for the living and she had not been alive that day. Merritt sat on the stone bench outside the house and did not knock. Eventually Isolde came out with 2 tin cups of black coffee and sat down beside her and said nothing for a full quarter hour. Then Isolde said, "Vane." Merritt said, "Yes." Isolde said, "He tried the same thing on the Kessler place 4 years ago. Different paper. Same handwriting, man. Kessler shot himself in December." Merritt said, "I need one person who can ride the ridge with me and read what's up there. I can pay. I can't pay much." Isolde looked at her a long time. Then she said, "I'm not sure I trust you yet, Merritt, but I trust Vane less, so I'll ride. But you should know, before we go 1 mile, that somebody inside your bunkhouse is drawing Vane's coin." Merritt's coffee stopped moving toward her mouth. Isolde said, I don't know which one. I only know that a man was seen leaving Vane's back office at 4 in the morning last Tuesday, and he was riding a horse with a Halloran brand. Merritt set the cup down. The wind moved through the pinion needles with a sound like paper tearing. Somewhere on the road behind them a hawk cried once and went still, and Merritt Halloran understood that the ranch was not merely under attack. The ranch had been infiltrated, and whoever the infiltrator was, he had eaten at her table. They started at the dam. Isolde rode ahead and Merritt behind, and Ezra was left at the ranch on purpose, because Ezra was one of the 4 men Merritt could not yet clear. It shamed her to think it. She thought it anyway. The dam was cottonwood and river stone, laid the way a man lays it who has done such work before, keyed into the bank with a shallow trench so the current could not lift it in one push. Isolde crouched beside it a long time. She said, 2 men. One does the stones, the other cuts the wood. The stone man is small and left-handed. The wood man wears boots resold in Corvell by the Mexican cobbler on Alameda Street, because I see the stitching pattern in the mud. That's a start. They rode east along the fence line. Twice they found places where wire had been cut and respliced with a splice so neat it disappeared unless you knew to look. Cattle had been let through and driven north. Isolde read the tracks. 19 head. For days ago. Driven slow, which meant the drivers had time, which meant they had a place to hold them without hurry. They followed the tracks to a box canyon 11 miles from the ranch and looked down from the rim. In the canyon below stood 19 head of Halloran cattle, and a branding fire, and 2 men working an iron over a Halloran H, turning it into a shape that Merritt did not at first recognize. Isolde recognized it. She said, Circle V. Vane's brand. Merritt lay in the dust on the rim and did not move for a long time. She could have taken the pistol from her saddlebag. She was still within the range at which the woman she had been 30 years ago could have hit either man with either hand. She did not take the pistol from her saddlebag. She took a small leather notebook from her coat and began to write, in a hand that had once written different notes in different notebooks. She wrote the date. She wrote the count. She wrote the description of the brand alteration. She wrote the descriptions of the 2 men. Isolde watched her write and said quietly, You've done this before. Merritt said, A long time ago. A different life. Isolde said, Under a different name. Merritt did not answer. Isolde did not press. They rode away from the canyon without being seen. That night at the ranch, Merritt sat at the kitchen table with the 4 remaining hands ranged around her. Ezra, a wiry old drover named Toomey, a young Tejano cowboy named Rafa Escalante, and a broad, quiet Swede named Anders Bly. She had known 3 of them for years. She had known Anders only 19 months, since the day he had walked up the road with a bedroll and a story about coming down from the Powder River country. She laid the forged note on the table. She laid beside it a rough sketch of the Circle V brand from the canyon. She said, One of you has been talking to Vane. I don't know which. I'm not going to ask which tonight. I'm going to ask something else. If the man who talked wants to walk out that door right now with a full month's wages and no questions, he can. No harm will come to him from me or from Ezra or from any man here. He has until I finish this cup of coffee. She drank the coffee slowly. Nobody moved. Toomey stared at the table. Rafa stared at Toomey. Anders stared at Merritt with pale blue eyes that did not blink. Ezra stared at the door as if willing it to open. It did not open. She set the empty cup down. She said, All right, then we work. She sent Rafa to ride the south fence and count. She sent Toomey to Corvell with a list of hardware, and told him to make sure he was seen buying every item. She sent Anders to the north pasture to move the remaining herd closer to the house. She kept Ezra by the barn to help her repair a broken hayrack. While they hammered, she asked him quietly whether he had ever, in his life, ridden a horse of hers into Corvell at 4 in the morning. He looked at her with such open, offended pain that she believed him without needing his answer. He gave her his answer anyway. No, ma'am. Not once. Not ever. She said. Then somebody else took a horse from our string and put it back before dawn. Ezra said, The tack room's been locked since Mr. Elias died. Only key I know of is on your ring. She checked her ring that night. The tack room key was there. But when she went to the tack room and looked at the lock in the lantern light, she saw the faintest, freshest scratch across the brass. The kind a picking wire leaves when a hand is skilled but not perfect. Somebody had been coming and going through that door without a key. She sat down on a hay bale and thought, in the quiet, of the reward poster in the pine chest. 30 years ago she had been called Merritt Dune, and she had been called the Dune Girl, and she had shot 4 men in one street in a Kansas cattle town over the murder of her first brother, and she had walked away from that life and burned every trace of it she could burn. And she had married a good man named Elias Halloran, and she had never told him her real name. Elias had known anyway. Elias had known and had never asked. That was the sort of man Elias had been. Now she sat in his tack room with a lock that had been picked by somebody she fed, and she understood that the woman named Dune was going to have to speak again. Once, in a voice the country had not heard in 3 decades. But not yet. Not until she knew every name. The fire came on the 9th night. It came from the west, downwind of the barn, and it came fast, which meant coal oil, which meant men. Merritt was already awake when Ezra pounded on her door, because she had smelled the smoke through the shutters half a minute before he arrived. She came out fully dressed. She had been sleeping fully dressed for a week. The barn was already lost. The hay in the loft went up like paper, and the roof timbers roared, and the horses inside screamed the way horses scream, which is a sound a rancher never forgets. Rafa was already at the barn door pulling animals out by their halters. His face black with soot, his shirt scorched. Ezra was working the pump handle at the trough while Toomey ran buckets. Anders was nowhere. Merritt shouted his name once into the smoke and got no answer. She ran toward the bunkhouse and found the door open and Anders's bunk empty and his rifle gone from the wall. She turned and ran back toward the fire. The stampede came 4 minutes later. 200 head of cattle had been driven up from the south pasture and stampeded straight through the corral fence toward the house. Merritt understood in one heartbeat what the fire had been for. The fire had been the flare. The stampede was the killing. She grabbed Ezra by the shoulder and pointed. He saw it. He turned white under the black soot. He shouted for Toomey and Rafa, and they threw themselves behind the stone smokehouse just as the leading edge of the herd came around the burning barn. They did not all make it. Toomey did not make it. Toomey tripped in a wagon rut 10 yards short of the smokehouse, and the herd took him under. And he was gone before he could shout, and there was nothing anyone could have done. Merritt saw it. She would see it every night for the rest of her life. The herd split around the smokehouse and thundered on into the dark. The barn collapsed in a bloom of sparks. When the noise stopped, there was only the crackling of the fire and Rafa weeping into his hands and Ezra kneeling in the dirt with his forehead against the smokehouse wall. At dawn, Sheriff Doyle rode up with 2 deputies and looked at the smoking ruin and told Merritt, in a voice pitched for the deputies to remember later, that it was a terrible accident but that leaving barn lanterns lit was a known hazard and that he would be filing his report accordingly. He did not dismount. He did not offer help. He rode away. An hour after him came Roan Petty with a new paper. This one was a formal offer from Cyrus Vane, dated that morning, for a price 40% below the price of the week before. Merritt took the paper and did not read it. She folded it once and put it in her apron pocket and walked back toward the ruin of the barn without a word. Roan Petty rode away smiling. They buried Toomey that afternoon under a pinyon behind the house. Rafa said the words in Spanish because he was the only one who could still speak. Ezra held Merritt's arm because her knees kept trying to give. She did not weep. She had not wept for Elias either, in front of anybody. She had never been that kind of woman. That night she sat alone on the porch with the shotgun across her knees. The barn glowed dull orange in the wet ashes. The bunkhouse door hung open. Anders had not returned. Anders was not going to return. Around midnight Isolde Warwick rode into the yard without being called. She sat down on the step beside Merritt and said, "I found where Anders went. He rode north to a line camp on Vane's spread. He's there now. He was paid $200 to open the corral gate and set the coal oil. He was paid another $100 to make sure your rifle wasn't in your bedroom when the fire started. He didn't manage the second part. That's the only reason you're alive. Merritt did not move. Isolde said, "You've lost the barn. You've lost a hand. You've lost 200 head. Doyle will not investigate. Vane will file the foreclosure in 11 days. Every play he has made was to get you to sign that paper in your pocket by sunrise. Are you going to sign it?" Merritt said, "No." Isolde said, "Then you should know something else. Anders isn't the only one. There's a second man inside your operation. Anders wasn't skilled enough to pick that tackroom lock. Somebody else picked it. Somebody who is still on this ranch tonight." Merritt looked at the porch boards. In the dark, in the ashes, in the awful weight of Toomey's death, she understood with a slow, cold clarity that she had lost. Vane had won. The ranch was finished. The men were beaten. She was an old woman on a porch with a shotgun and a folded paper in her pocket, and there was no army coming, and there was no law coming, and Elias was still dead and would be dead forever. She sat like that until the eastern sky went gray. Then, without a word to Isolde, she stood up, walked to the barn behind the house that had not burned, climbed to the rafters, and lifted down the locked pine chest. She opened the chest on the kitchen table at sunrise. Ezra was there. Rafa was there. Isolde was there. None of them had slept. Inside were the Colt with the pearl grips, the cracked belt, the reward poster, and beneath those, wrapped in oilcloth, a ledger. It was 30 years old. It was Merritt's own hand in Merritt's own girlhood, and it contained the names of the 4 men she had killed in that Kansas cattle town, the reasons she had killed them, and, in a separate column, the names of the 6 men who had ordered her brother killed and had escaped her that year. The first name on that separate column at the very top was Cyrus Vane. Ezra looked at the ledger. Then he looked at Merritt. He said, all those years he lived 9 miles from you. All those years he watched." Merritt said he didn't know. "He never knew my name. I was 17 when he saw me last. He was 29. He gave the order in a room in Wichita I was standing outside of. He never saw my face clearly. He came to Usler County 12 years after I did. That's the miracle and the curse of it. He didn't buy this ranch because it was mine. He bought it because it was land. And then, over the years, he began to want it. And he began to move against it. And the woman he was moving against was the girl he had once ordered killed and had failed to kill." Rafa said quietly, "You could have shot him any time in 20 years, Senora." Merritt said, "Yes." He said, "Why didn't you?" She said, "Because Elias asked me not to. Because I promised. Because I had learned that killing a man does not bring back the brother he killed. Because the woman I had been in Kansas was drowning me, and Elias pulled me out, and I owed him a life that did not carry a gun. So I did not carry a gun. And Vane grew old, and I grew old, and Elias died on a good horse, and here we are." Isolde said, "And now?" Merritt said, "And now I have a choice." They sat around the table. She laid it out plainly, because she needed them to understand and to choose with her. Choice 1 was simple. She would ride into Corvell that night, alone, and she would find Cyrus Vane in his back office, and she would kill him. He was 70. She was 62. She was faster than she had been at 30 and slower than she had been at 20, but he had never been fast at all, and he would die surprised. She would then be hanged because Doyle would see to that, but the ranch would be free of him. His operation without him would collapse within a year, and his men would scatter, and the auction paper would burn with him. Ezra said, "No." She looked at him. Ezra said, "Because you would be dead and this ranch would go to whoever the county appointed to run it, and it would be sold at auction anyway. And because Toomey did not die so you could hang. And because there are innocent people in this. Vane has a daughter in Corvell. He has a granddaughter. They live in the White House with the wisteria. They know nothing about the note or the fire or Toomey. If you shoot Vane, you take from that child what he tried to take from you. You become him. I have loved you and Elias for 20 years, and I will not watch you become him." Merritt closed the ledger. She said, "Then choice 2. Choice 2 was harder. Choice 2 required patience she was not sure she had left. Choice 2 required Isolde to ride, that morning, to a federal marshal in Fort Ellender who owed Isolde a debt from the scout years, and to bring him back to Corvell with a warrant based on the forged note. the altered brands, the testimony of Anders Bly if Anders could be taken alive, and the corroborating evidence in Merritt's notebook. Choice 2 required Rafa to ride to the 3 neighboring ranches whose owners had lost land to Vane over the last decade and to ask them, plainly, whether they would stand up and speak in a hearing if a federal man was present to keep Doyle out of it. Choice 2 required Ezra to protect the ranch for 3 days without her, because Merritt herself would ride into Corvell that evening, walk into the bank, and offer to sign Vane's paper at his lower price, on the single condition that he meet her in the town square at noon 3 days hence to complete the transaction publicly, in front of the county clerk and the Corvell newspaper. Vane would agree. Vane would agree because Vane wanted, above all things, the public satisfaction of the widow's surrender. Vane's vanity was the weakness he had never known he had. Isolde said, and the second man on the ranch. The one who picked the lock. Merritt said, him I already know. They looked at her. She said, it was not one of you. It was not Anders alone. Roan Petty has been coming and going from that tack room for 6 weeks. He was Elias's stable boy 15 years ago. Elias fired him for stealing tack. He knows where every board on this place creaks. He remembered which board. Vane hired him for exactly that memory. He is the one who dammed the creek. He is the small left-handed man Isolde read at the water. He walked in and out of my barn while I slept, and I did not know it, because I could not imagine a boy Elias had once forgiven becoming this. Ezra said, then Roan Petty rides into that square, too. Merritt said, yes. She stood up. She lifted the Colt from the chest. She weighed it in her hand for the first time in 30 years. She said, in a voice none of them had heard before, I am not going to draw this in the square. I am going to wear it once so the men who know what it means will see it. And then I am going to put it back in this chest, and I am not going to lift it again as long as I live. Isolde said, and if the plan fails? Merritt said, then it fails and we do the other thing, and the child in the White House grows up without her grandfather, and I hang and the ranch goes to the county. But we try the honest road first because Elias asked me to, and because Toomey deserves a court, not a killing. At sundown Isolde rode north for the marshal. Rafa rode east for the neighbors. Ezra saddled Merritt's mare and held the stirrup, and Merritt Halloran, who had been Merritt Doone, put on her black wool coat, buckled the cracked belt around her hips, and rode 9 miles into Corvell to lie to Cyrus Vane one last time. She walked into the bank at 6:30. Vane was still there. Vane was always still there. She laid the offer paper on his desk and told him, quietly, that she would sign it in the square at noon on Thursday, before the clerk, before the newspaper, before whatever witnesses he chose. Vane smiled the small tight smile of an old man who has finally been given the last thing he wanted. He agreed. He offered her tea again. She refused again. As she turned to leave he noticed the belt at her hips and the walnut grip of the pistol above it, and he said mildly, are we expecting trouble on the road, Mrs. Halloran? She said, one never knows, Mr. Vane. And she walked out. Roan Petty was leaning on the hitching post outside. He was rolling a cigarette. When he saw the belt his fingers stopped. He looked up at her face. She looked down at his. Neither of them spoke. She untied her mare and rode away, and she felt his eyes on her back until the road bent. For 3 days the ranch worked. Ezra rebuilt what could be rebuilt of the corral. Rafa returned from the neighboring ranches with the word of the Kessler widow, of the Ortiz brothers, of the old German Faust, all of whom would come to the square if a federal marshal stood in it. Isolde returned on Thursday morning with a spare-boned man in a dark coat and a nickel star, whose name was Marshal Halbert Kroom, and whose debt to Isolde was old enough and heavy enough that he had ridden 3 nights straight to pay it. At 11:30 on Thursday, the Corvell town square began to fill. Word had traveled the way word travels in dry country, which is fast and without visible cause. The Kessler widow came in her buggy in a black dress. The Ortiz brothers came on their working horses with their hats in their hands. Old Faust came on foot, leaning on his stick. The newspaper editor came with his boy who carried the camera. The county clerk came reluctantly and with sweat on his upper lip. And Sheriff Doyle came, too, because he had to, and he stood on the boardwalk in front of his office with his 2 deputies and his thumbs in his belt, and he watched the crowd form with a face like an animal that has just heard a shutter break. Cyrus Vane arrived at noon exactly. He arrived in a carriage. He arrived with Roan Petty on the driver's box and two long-coated men on horses behind. He stepped down into the dust and adjusted his cuffs and smiled at the crowd because he believed the crowd had come to watch him win. Merritt walked out of the shade of the church porch. She was not wearing the belt. She was carrying the ledger. She was carrying the notebook. She was carrying the forged note. Behind her walked Marshal Croom with the nickel star pinned openly on his coat. And behind him walked Isolde and Ezra and Rafa and the Kessler widow and the Ortiz brothers and old Faust. The marshal spoke first. He introduced himself. He named Vane. He named Doyle. He read the warrant. He read the charges. Forgery, cattle theft, arson, conspiracy, the murder by criminal negligence of one Thaddeus Toomey, attempted extortion of land. He did not shout. He read as a man reads a receipt. Vane's face did not change until the marshal named Roan Petty as the man who had dammed the creek and set the fire, and named Anders Bly, in custody 2 days now at Fort Ellender, as the man who had opened the corral. Then Vane's face changed. It became, briefly, the face of the man who had given the order in a room in Wichita 30 years ago. Merritt saw it and knew that she had not misremembered. Roan Petty broke first. Roan Petty went for his pistol. He was fast. He was left-handed. He got the pistol out of the holster and half up before Isolde Warwick's carbine. From the church porch behind Merritt, put a round through his shoulder and dropped him into the dust. He lived. Isolde had shot to break the arm, not the man. He lay in the dust and screamed for a doctor, and then, when the doctor did not come at once, he began to name names, and he named them for 15 minutes without stopping. And the newspaper editor's boy wrote in a small book as fast as his hand could move. Doyle tried to walk away. Marshal Croom's second deputy, a quiet Kiowa man Croom had brought from Fort Ellender, stepped into Doyle's path and put a hand on Doyle's chest and said one word. Doyle sat down on the boardwalk. Vane did not run. Vane did not fight. Vane stood in the square with his hands loose at his sides and looked, for the first time, fully at Merritt's face. He looked a long time, and then, in a voice pitched for her alone, he said, "Wichita." And she said, "Yes," and that was all they said. He turned and let the marshal take his elbow and walked to the carriage he had arrived in, which was now to carry him to Fort Ellender. Roan Petty's confession, and the forged note in Merritt's pocket, and the altered brands in the box canyon which Isolde led Croom's deputies to that afternoon, and the testimony of Anders Bly, who had been broken in 3 days of federal custody, ended the Vane operation completely within a month. Vane died in a federal jail cell in Austin the following spring, of the same failing heart Elias had died of, though slower and less kind. His daughter and granddaughter kept the White House with the wisteria, and Merritt paid for the granddaughter's schooling for 11 years and never told the girl why. Merritt paid a price. She had promised Elias to bury the woman named Dune, and in the square that day she had let that woman rise to the edge of the grave, and something in her never went back to sleep. She woke every night for the rest of her life at the hour of the fire, and she saw Toomey go under the herd, and she saw Vane's face say Wichita, and she did not weep, because she had never been that kind of woman, but she sat on the porch until dawn with a cup of coffee going cold in her hand. The ranch survived. The barn was rebuilt in the spring by Ezra and Rafa and by the sons of the Ortiz brothers, and the timber for it was cut and hauled from the Kessler widow's woodlot as a gift she refused to be paid for. The cattle recovered slowly. The East Creek ran clear again after the dam was pulled down stone by stone in a single afternoon by 14 men, and one woman who had walked out from Corvell to help without being asked. The auction notice, which Merritt had kept folded in her apron pocket for 11 days, she burned in the kitchen stove without ceremony on the morning the marshal's paper arrived from Austin voiding the note. She did not keep the ranch alone. She could not, and she did not wish to. Within a year the Halloran spread became something no ranch in Usler County had ever been. She signed papers with Ezra and with Rafa and with Isolde Warwick and with a young Kessler cousin who had been orphaned by Kessler's suicide, and the papers made all 5 of them owners, in shares, of the 8 sections that had been Elias's. Merritt kept the house. The others kept the work and the profits and the votes. when she died 11 years later of a winter fever that took her fast. The ranch simply went on without her, which she had told Ezra on the last clear evening of her life was the only ending she had ever wanted. Corvell changed too, though slower. Doyle went to federal prison for 6 years and came back a smaller man and did not run for sheriff again. The new sheriff was a woman named Priscilla Vane, the granddaughter with the Wisteria House, who took the office at 30 and held it for 22 years and never once in that time spoke her grandfather's name in public. The Colt with the pearl grips went back into the pine chest, and the chest went back into the rafters, and neither was ever opened again in Merritt Halloran's life. She was buried beside Elias under the same pinyon as Toomey, on ground she had bought section by section with a man she had loved without ever telling him her first name. Would you have chosen justice, or taken revenge with your own hands? The wind still comes down from the Sabinal Ridge in late autumn, dry and mean, and it moves across the porch of the Halloran Ranch, and it lifts the dust off a brand that outlived every man who tried to change it.